like to welcome you to another edition of Critical Issues, Alternative Views. I'm Ron Kramer, and I'll be the host for today's program. Joining me today is one of our regulars, Felix Brooks. Felix is the Director of Diversity and Inclusion at Kalamazoo Valley Community College, and also is an adjunct professor in criminal justice program at Western Michigan University. We didn't know if he'd be here today. He thought he had jury duty, but he was able to escape and get here. So. And we would like to welcome back two very special guests. Both of these folks have been with us before. On my left is Denise Keele. Denise is a professor in the political science department and also in the environmental and sustainability studies program.
Good job.
It's a long name.
Well done.
And also Denise is one of the co-chairs of the WMU Working Group on Climate Change, as is our other guest, Paul Clements. Thank you. Paul is also a professor in the political science department at Western. He's also the Democratic candidate for the 6th Congressional District, running against Congressman Upton in the election coming up next year. And again, a co-chair of the WMU Working Group on Climate Change. So I'd like to welcome all of you to the program today.
Thanks.
And climate change is, of course, a huge issue. Paul, you have made climate change a central part of your political campaign for Congress. And Denise, you've been working on this issue for a long time. Felix and I have discussed this on the program before. So what we really want to focus on today, I mean, everybody knows about climate change, global warming leading to climate change. We know that it's human caused, and we know that we're probably going to raise the temperature at least 2 degrees Celsius. At least we're trying to hold it to that. We might not be successful in that effort if current trends continue, but we're trying to do that. And we know that it's caused by carbon emissions. The scientific evidence is just overwhelming on this issue, and in fact, new evidence comes out all the time, and it seems to grow more stark all the time as we look at the projections for what's going to happen in the future. So we need to do something about this, right? Yeah. And the United Nations has created a process to try to do something about global warming and climate chaos that might result. And so Denise, could you give us a little bit of background on what the UN has been doing and then how it leads up to the focus? There's going to be a summit in Paris in December. That's what I think we want to spend most of our time talking about. But let's have some background, first of all, about this whole process that's leading up to Paris.
Sure. So this is what they call Conference of the Parties. This is the 21st Conference of the Parties.
Wow. So
we've been doing this for a little while. I guess we have. Actually, the real context of this is to think about the broader environmental consciousness that came in the 1970s, at least for the Western developing world. 1972 is the first conference on the environment held by the United Nations at Stockholm, where international parties get together and say, we might have some commons, boundaries, issues with water, with air, with fisheries. And so we start trying to make some international agreements starting in 1972. And so that's why they name these every year. They're supposed to have different conferences on different things, right? A lot of you might be familiar with another big one that was in 1987, the Montreal Protocol, which was for chlorofluorocarbons. It's often used as a model for how we might do climate change.
Because that was extremely successful,
That's exactly right.
The world came together, we've got a problem.
Made a deadline, made commitments, they stuck to them. Now we had alternatives and there wasn't a big fight against that substance, so there are some key differences, but it often can be, at least there is one international success to draw on here.
And to let people know that was concerning the hole in the ozone layer.
That's exactly right. So if you we're around in the 80s that we actually had newspapers and they would have these big pictures of the hole in the atmosphere, which got people's attention. It was a very concrete problem that we could show. The next thing that happened in 1988 is what we all talk about as the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. That's a UN-sanctioned World Meteorological Organization. We get together and we say, wow, there's something else going on with this atmosphere. Maybe we should need an international body that looks at this science.
And then that panel is basically most of the world's climate scientists.
That's right. Over 200 scientists from almost every country is represented in that. Did you want to?
Yeah, we might point out that it was back in the late 80s that the National Academy of Sciences was first asked to look at it.
That's
and
right.
They said climate change is real, it's dangerous, it's caused by humans. That was the late 1987.
87. And well, it's no mistake that the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change was formed in 1988, which is when James Hansen from our very own NASA starts bringing this issue to the attention of Congress and here in the United States. So the next Rio is, you got to pick a good place for your conferences, is what I always tell my students. Rio de Janeiro, 1992, is then this another big, it's been 20 years since we had the first environmental conference. Now we've got climate change, and they have what's called the Earth Summit. And 1992 is when we put in the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, which is what has then been driving this process and why we're at COP21. Some of the other notable conferences, Berlin, 2005, is the lead up to, many of you are probably familiar with Kyoto. Yeah. The Kyoto, so this is, the names of these are where these conferences were held. That's 2007, which tries to create the first voluntary binding agreements for, voluntary binding, I know, that's the UN language.
Oxymoron there.
Copenhagen, 2009 is another one you're probably familiar with, which was meant to be the implementation and was pretty much seen as a failure to figure out what those goals should be. And since then, we've been building Lima last year to now COP21 Paris 2015 is where we are in that schedule, and just a little background of that.
Okay. And last September 2014 in New York City,
yes.
Ban Ki-moon, the Secretary General of the United Nations, brought together a lot of the world leaders to get them to focus their attention on what was going to be happening in Paris. Now, that was even before the Lima conference, COP20.
Yes. Well, the push has been, Paris this year is supposed to be either we renew the Kyoto commitments, we re-sign them, or we change them. And so there have been deadlines sort of built in. And so the last 2 years have been about the build-up to, are we going to have some sort of agreement, or re-agreement, or new agreement? What are we going to do, folks?
What we're looking at is this is to be the first time that we get a universal agreement.
That's right.
Because Kyoto didn't get everybody on board.
It did not.
And if you leave out China and India, then that's obviously not going to address the issue. But this is the first one where we have a real chance of getting every major country on board.
Agreement, yeah. And there's 196 member states to the United Nations Framework on Convention on Climate Change. So that's a lot of member states to say that we're going to get an agreement out of. Yeah.
So what's going to happen in Paris, Paul? I mean, I've been reading a lot about, there's a big buildup, and I've been reading a lot online. And I have to say, mostly it's pessimistic that I've been reading. That we're not going to get anything.
Yeah.
But what are the chances?
I think we've got a pretty good chance of getting a universal agreement that everyone buys into. Problem is, we know it's not going to be good enough.
Right.
We'll get an agreement. People will start to move, but it'll still be, a lot of it will be voluntary. It won't begin to get to the reductions in carbon pollution and greenhouse gases that will keep us to that 2 degrees Celsius boundary. Because that's what the scientists have told us. We can't go past 2 degrees. Things get immeasurably worse after that. But unfortunately, that's where we're headed right now. And Paris is not going to stop us from passing 2 degrees.
Yeah.
What I'm hoping for, what I hope it can do is get everyone on board and then set up the right architecture for a program. So then that architecture can be a basis for future progress, where everyone agrees to cut down their carbon emissions. But it's not just making that agreement. It's a question of how do we move forward with the technology so that we can be reducing those carbon emissions. How do we move forward with the institutions to manage the refugees and the other victims of climate change? These are extremely, technically, the technical challenge is we can easily solve that one. I mean, we know we can get to a virtually zero carbon future. We know we can get where we need to get. Technical problems are not the challenge. The challenges are political and institutional, and that's what we're hoping to see, a substantial step forward in Paris.
One thing that I think that is getting both negative and positive press on what's going to be the outcome of Paris is we changed a little bit of the strategies of negotiations. There's been a lot of pre-negotiation the last couple of years, and instead of getting together and saying, what are you going to cut, what are you going to cut, and doing that together, what this conference is asking countries to do is come in advance to publish what their emissions efforts are. And they're calling it intended nationally determined contributions. And that doesn't mean contributions to greenhouse gases. It means, what is your intended contribution? So it's a little bit different ask to say, well, hey, what are you going to come to the table with? Not get to the table and let's argue each other down. So it's a little bit different negotiation tactic. And I think that might be a little bit more successful. I'm a little bit more helpful.
Asking folks to put some real skin in the game.
That's right.
Here,
and you're asking them not in a conversation with someone else, you're saying, hey, you bring the best that you can to this, and then we'll start
Because I think then it becomes public also.
That's right.
You know.
That's right.
Put pressure.
Yeah.
Put pressure on them. in
That's
some way.
exactly right. And so I kind of think that it might be a useful strategy, and so it gives me a little bit of hope that at least folks, because if you're doing this politically, you're going to always say that you can do more than you actually can, hopefully, and then if we whittle that down, we might actually get some agreements.
And
But right now, Paul, you're absolutely right. Sorry, Felix. Those intended contributions that have come in, like what countries think they're going to be able to cut emissions by or do, are holding us at 3 degrees. So we've got a long way to go.
And what we've got to acknowledge is that our history has been one of failure.
Yes.
Failure to get an agreement.
Yes.
So getting a universal agreement that moves a substantial distance in the right direction, that will be a major success.
Right.
Then what we have to see is that that's just a first step.
That's right.
And then we've got to keep going even much more strongly in the next couple of years.
Right.
We don't have a lot of time.
We do not.
One of the sort of factoids on this I think is really powerful,
Yeah.
is that within a couple of years, by 2017, there's going to be enough energy infrastructure in place around the world to take our planet to 2 degrees Celsius. So after 2 years, if we want to not go past that 2 degrees, it's not just a question of smart building. It's a question of retrofitting.
Right.
It's a question of reducing what's already out there, which is much more expensive,
Yeah.
much more difficult. So, when we see that we've been so late in coming to this, that every day you leave it makes it more expensive.
Right.
You're losing money when you don't make progress, and that's where we are right now.
And I think that's why it's important to have all the big players at the table for the first
That's
time
right.
too.
Yep.
Particularly the Chinese and the Indians being there.
Yeah.
Yeah, so what about the role? I mean, I think sometimes conservative groups in the United States that want to try to block any kind of an agreement in the past have always pointed to China and India and saying, well, these are emerging major powers, they're contributing a lot. China's actually passed the U.S.
Sure.
now in terms of carbon emissions, right?
Right.
Sure.
And so one way to perhaps block agreement is to say, well, the Chinese and the Indians have to be on board, but of course they're resistant because they point out, we're the ones, the U.S., that have thrown up the vast majority of the carbon, right?
But to be serious, 15 years ago I could have
That's right.
accepted that. You can't accept that
Right.
anymore. We're way past that.
Right.
I mean, they've got to be on board.
Right.
They've got to be on board. Yes, the United States historically has a much greater
right.
contribution than other countries. We're per capita still at a very, very high level. We have to take the leadership. We have to play a larger role than these other countries in many respects.
Right.
But they've got to be there too.
They've
got to have skin in the game. That's all there is to it.
Right.
Yeah, and so, I mean, that was my point. So they are going to be
Now
there.
they're coming in.
They're
You bet.
coming in, and
Yep.
so
That's right.
that ploy, I guess, to try to block agreements to say they're not
Right.
contributing at all is gone away because they are now. And what about the U.S. and China signed an accord last year? Did they?
Yes.
What was involved with that, and how does that play into what's going to happen at Paris? This particular issue.
Well, that again is supposed to be this lead up to Paris. Every country is going to have skin in this game, and they're supposed to be publishing in advance their country's efforts. And the way that China has chosen to frame this is to when they will stop peak emissions, which is maybe not the most scientific of targets. So they say, and this actually goes to a larger issue, Ron. One of the reasons China and India always come up, and one of the failures currently, as Paul says, 15 years ago, even 21 years ago, it might have been okay. What we did in 1992 is we put countries in different boxes and said, those who can should do these things. Those that are developing don't have to do those things. And China and India are still considered countries that are not required to cut emissions. So we have to fix that first. And we have to say what we're doing now, which is every country must put some skin in the game. Now, the U.S. has started to do some things that I think we'll talk about a little bit later. I'm not so sure saying when I'm going to stop emitting peak is the best thing that the Chinese could bring to the table. But on the other hand, in some cities, China has stricter air quality controls on greenhouse gases than the United States does. Now that's not overall, to be sure, and it's definitely not enough. But there's a problem here with our framework, and it's one of these big political challenges. We still have to deal with what the UN calls common but differentiated responsibilities. Some of us are able to, as the US, pay for the mitigation that needs to happen and make that investment, and some of us are going to be better able to deal with the effects. And we have to deal with that on the global scale. And that's been part of the rub of these negotiations over the last 20 years. So shouldn't India be able to develop a little bit more and reach the type of standard of living with those technologies? What kinds of financial efforts? To me, there are two big issues. It's the universal agreement at 2 degrees, and the other big thing is the Green Climate Fund. How will this be financed, and how will we deal with the idea that some countries are better able to economically handle both the effects and the transition?
Well,
that's a huge issue.
And for me, that's an equity issue, because all
absolutely
countries are
is.
not going to be able to do this at the same rate. They don't have the wherewithal or the resources to do
That's
that.
right.
But we have to look at it from an equity standpoint. Those who can contribute more should.
That's exactly right.
And those who have more historic responsibility,
Should.
particularly responsibility after we knew how serious this was.
That's right.
Because you can say, well, before, I don't know, 1970 or something,
That's right.
We were generating greenhouse gases, but no one knew what the problem was.
That's right.
For the last 20 years, we've
known.
known. And we've still been increasing, and we've still been doing more of it, and we've not been addressing the issue. So the question is, who's going to suffer from that?
That's right.
And we know it's, for the most part, the poor, the
Yes.
vulnerable, the developing countries,
right.
the people in like Bangladesh, low-lying areas. They're going to pay the biggest price for this. And we have to help that.
That's right.
We have to address that.
That's right.
We bear some responsibility
We
there.
bear a
think
lot of responsibility there.
The target
so.
right now is $100 billion a year from the supposed rich countries that are in that chart
Right,
to the supposed
right.
poor countries that
Right,
are in the other
right.
side of that chart.
But $100 billion a year is fine.
Is-
Already, this last
Yeah.
couple of years, there have been over $120 billion in costs
right.
from excessively extreme weather
That's
events
right.
compared to what we would expect without climate change.
Yeah.
So the costs of this are already way more, and that's only going to increase.
Yeah.
So this $100 billion a year, it's a start.
And that's a pledge right now.
Right.
That's what I intend to give
Right.
you. So it's, again, underwhelmingly not enough, but perhaps strategies, as you're saying, Paul, on the right track if we continue to beef them up and
If
go
we
back
look
to
at-
them year after year.
If we look at total world aid
Yeah.
to developing countries, it's been about 100, a little bit above that a year.
Yeah.
So we've got to double that,
that.
just to get to the baseline.
That's right.
And then we've got to go forward from there.
Yeah.
And again, let's be clear that these Syrian refugees,
Yes.
National Geographic has said this is the first big wave of refugees caused by climate change.
That's right.
Because they had the droughts, they had extreme heat that drove a lot of their rural dwellers into the cities that
Yeah.
helped to precipitate the current crisis that meant they couldn't make it where they were living. And so Europe is experiencing one of our first great waves of climate refugees, but that's going to be small scale. There will be many times that in the future, and we see that the institutions today are not even equipped to deal with this one.
That's right. Yes.
So there have been charges in the past that the large, powerful countries dominate this process, that once you get there, there are sort of secret backdoor kind of meetings in which the final details of whatever agreement gets hashed out, and the vast majority of the delegates are sort of there, but they're more stage props than serious negotiators. Has that been the case for the previous conferences, and is that something that's likely to happen again this time? That would seem to work against the.
We're
Yes.
political scientists. We have this word in political science called realpolitik.
The K, exactly. I always talk about
Has that been the case? Yeah, probably so.
Absolutely.
Will that
Absolutely.
continue to be the case? You bet.
You
Yeah.
bet. And Brad,
Yeah.
I, as a political scientist, I always sort of laugh at that when people ask me that question. So I'm like, well, of course, that's what it is. Like,
Politics.
how would you expect? Why would you expect it to be different? And why is that always, said with such this negativity, right? That is the way it is. And to go back to China on that, one of these big things has been for them to keep their developing country status so that they are not supposedly required under how the UN does some of these things. And they've led a huge coalition, a block of countries that want to remain developing in certain categories to use that status against other countries when they get into negotiations, as has the G7, as has the Russian Federation. I mean, there are definite coalitions that are vying against each other. Yeah.
So does that particular process of realpolitik, does that spell doom for the whole conference then, or is there a way to still make progress given that reality of the negotiating process?
Citibank,
Yeah.
not what you'd think of as like a progressive leading organization. They came out with a report this last year saying that by 2060, with a business as usual trajectory, that the cost of the effects of climate change is going to exceed $44 trillion. Now, these are big numbers. Okay, that's more than 2.5 times total U.S. GDP.
Right.
So they're a bank.
Yeah.
They don't want to lose this money.
Right.
They don't want to lose these profits. I mean, the reason I think that yes, realpolitik can
Yeah.
give us something is because people are figuring out that this is going to cost them.
Yeah.
And if you're an insurance company, then
Yeah.
you don't like it if sea level rises a meter or 2 meters,
right.
because that's going to be enormously expensive for you. So yeah,
Yeah.
realpolitik, it can take us in the right direction. Finally,
Yes.
it can help us. It can nudge us forward.
Yes.
But we're not, as we've all been saying, that this conference, that what's on the table right now, doesn't look like it's going to get anywhere close to where we need to be.
Right.
And that's where realpolitik is not enough.
That's right.
We've got to have leadership. We've got to have people stepping forward. And that's what I hope to see the beginning of that in Paris.
That's right. And the counter to realpolitik is always transparency and accountability and open agreements. And that's why I do
Democracy.
That's why I do sort of like this idea of, hey, why don't you publish your contributions in advance? Why don't you publish your intended monetary contributions in advance? So at least there's some transparency out there. The Guardian, right, who's doing, I think, a fantastic job in their
fantastic
series
job.
called Keep
Yeah.
It in the Ground, if you haven't read any of those, can go check on that stuff and call people out, right? Like, that's how it works.
And you talk about keep it in the ground. 350.org has been saying
Same,
that,
yes.
that we've got to keep 80% of the established petroleum reserves, coal reserves, in the ground.
Yeah.
And this is something where, frankly, we're not going to see major progress on this in Paris.
Right.
So this is one of these areas where we need to see continued divestment campaigns.
That's right.
We need to see the global community moving towards holding, because let's be frank, who have been the major offenders here? It's the people who profit from carbon pollution.
Right.
And those have been the coal companies and for the
oil
most part the
companies.
petroleum companies.
But strangely enough, this summer we got ourselves a little small snapshot when the price of oil bottomed out, and now what you've seen from some major oil companies is they've stopped exploratory drilling.
Right.
Right, but that's a supply and demand thing. That's not because of their conscience.
No, it has nothing to do
figuring
with
out-
conscience at all.
Right.
It has everything to do with what the reality is.
Yeah.
It's much more expensive. So to the extent that it becomes more expensive for them to have to go underground and
That's right.
drill these resources,
Right.
then it works to our advantage also. So.
That's right.
Right, so we've had a little bit of good fortune in that respect, but the reality is that carbon pollution is increasing, and it's got to be, and we've got to move it to where it's decreasing.
Yes.
And the reality is that those oil companies, and I know you have some information on this, that they have been spending millions of dollars in disinformation to undermine. You talk about transparency
That's right.
and accountability. They've been trying to spread lies.
That's right. The
Spread
exact
doubt,
opposite.
just so they can make more profits. And I think this needs to come back to them one way.
Yes.
What goes around comes around. But that's part of why we've had so little progress up to date, because the powerful vested interests that benefit from pollution have spent a lot of money to keep polluting.
We want
Yes.
to continue to do business as usual.
Right.
That's
And
right.
reap in large profits.
Right.
That's right.
You mentioned there's been a lot of research, investigative journalistic research recently into Exxon, now
Yeah.
ExxonMobil. And so Inside Climate News, which is a very important website, has done some great investigative reporting. They've gotten access to a lot of internal documents from Exxon. They've carried out intensive interviews with former employees of Exxon. And so they've just started to publish a series of reports. And along with them, the Union of Concerned Scientists, having access to some of the same data, also issued a recent report called the Climate Deception Dossiers. And then even the Columbia Journalism School has a energy and environmental reporting project. And they, along with the Los Angeles Times, have carried out some investigative journalism. So you have three sort of independent sources that have been carrying out an investigation into what Exxon knew and when it knew it.
Right.
To go back to the Watergate days,
Yeah,
what
that's
did
right.
the president
Still-
know and when did he know it, right?
Still the questions. yeah.
Howard Baker's famous question during the Watergate. But what did Exxon know? Well, according to these investigative reports, Exxon knew in the late 1970s that global warming was real, that it was man-made caused, right? It was caused by humans, that it was probably going to go to around 2 to 3 degrees Celsius if we didn't do anything, and that would have extremely catastrophic consequences. I mean, they pretty much nailed it. They were pretty much right on everything, and this was in the 1970s. And at the time, the Exxon scientists were allowed to carry out additional studies. The management at Exxon was concerned enough about this issue that they allowed for further research to go on, and so through the early 80s, they did additional research, coming up with even more verification.
And I believe that they even stayed away from certain resources in Indonesia, where it would have released enormous carbon dioxide. It would have been like a major driver. And they said, okay, we'll hold off on that one. So it had some positive effect.
Right.
Yeah.
Again, I think that's their own risk assessment of economic model of unconscious. I'll use your quote from earlier.
So their scientists are telling them, hey, this is a major problem. It's going to have catastrophic consequences. We're part of the problem in a sense because they're pointing out that it's the carbon emissions. And then, so the company has a big switch, however, in the late 1980s, about the time it's really hitting politically, right? James Hansen makes his famous speech before the Congress in 1988, and the UN is getting involved, as you described earlier. And about this time, Exxon switches gears. And now it starts to fund generally conservative think tanks to do, quote, research that sows disinformation. Again, it's just outright deception about what's really happening and what the effects are going to be. And they spent something like $30 million in this effort to fund climate. And they weren't the only one, of course. There were other fossil fuel companies that were doing the same kind of thing, and a whole slew of conservative think tanks were popping up all over the place. The Heartland Institute, for example, and then some of the more established ones like the American Enterprise Institute. And they're hiring people who have some scientific credibility, some scientific background, but they're not climate scientists. And so they can say, well, scientists say, but they aren't climate scientists. They don't do research and publish in climate science. So they have this sort of thin veneer of scientific credibility, and at the same time, what they're doing is creating doubt. Doubt is our product. That actually goes back to the Tobacco Institute efforts to muddy up the waters with regard to tobacco.
They wanted to build an infrastructure of deniability, and they were willing to fund that heavily to do that, get that information out there. Because they know that the average citizen wasn't going to read all this other stuff because it sounded too complicated.
And this misinformation, this idea that, oh, maybe it's not caused by humans, maybe there's something else, obviously this has been really important, but it's linked in with another dynamic. And that is to say, we've all been talking about how it's really going to take greater international cooperation to address this. And unfortunately, here in our country, we have a political party, one of our two big ones, that sees greater international cooperation, bigger U.S. commitments to international relations as a threat. And we have this funny thing where sometimes people decide what they believe by what suits their values. And if you don't like to have or their economic interests, or their interests.
In a place like Kentucky or West Virginia.
And if it's going to lead to an outcome that they're not very comfortable with, then they might say, and they have said, I don't think I believe in that. I don't think I believe in that. And then that has been part of the process, along with Exxon and Shell and the other oil companies actually just giving money to politicians. Frankly, buying them off to set up a firewall, a block in Congress to the kind of deep changes, the really strong leadership from the United States that would be the critical variable in moving the world forward.
Yeah, it's fascinating to think about how, and unfortunately, how successful those disinformation campaigns were, how well they worked on a segment of the population too that maybe is just against regulations or their value bases, don't like big government, all of these things. This fed right into that, and I think some of the all-time lows were around 30%. We've inched our way back to 40% was the last Yale communication study. 40% of the American public thinks that scientists agree. because of this whole, other scientists' disinformation.
Yeah,
and around 48% think it's human caused. It's hard to go into an international agreement with less than half a majority of public opinion support helping you move that forward.
But
This has been.
the listeners to this show,
Yes.
probably most of the listeners live around Kalamazoo in this
Yes.
area, this county or in nearby counties. Well, if your representative is Congressman Fred Upton,
Yes.
then we bear a particular responsibility
Yes, we do.
and a particular opportunity. Because we talk about this kind of corruption. Congressman Upton is someone who used to understand,
That's right.
and who does understand, frankly, that climate change is real, caused by humans, and dangerous. He used to say we need to do whatever we can to reduce carbon pollution.
Everything should be on the table, he
Everything
That's
should be
right.
on the table, correct. But then what happened? Then he
Yes.
got an opportunity to be chair of the Energy and Commerce Committee, the most powerful committee in the House of Representatives on climate policy, and it's apparently part of the price of that
right.
chairmanship was his respect for science. Because since then, he has gone on the record as basically a climate science denier,
Yeah.
not getting the science that previously he seemed to understand. And so what that has meant has got to be, we need to understand that. And our listeners need to understand that if the president had had support from Congress, we would have had
That's right.
American leadership on this 5 years ago.
That's right.
We would be already far down the road to addressing this internationally throughout the world. But because of our Congress, and specifically because of our congressman, we have not had that type of progress because he and the Republicans in the House of Representatives and in the Senate have been blocking the president, who would like to take stronger leadership, from taking that leadership. And so the whole world has been held back from stronger progress.
Yes.
And let's back that up a little bit further too, go back to Exxon.
Right.
Because what if,
Yeah.
in 1989, after a decade of their scientists telling them, climate change is real, it's human caused, we're looking at catastrophic consequences if this continues, we need to do something to reduce our own carbon emissions. What if Exxon had come out and said, look, we understand this problem, here's our research on it. What if they had adopted a business model to move toward alternative energy at that point?
Right.
What if, could the Republicans in Congress have mounted the kind of disinformation campaign that they have and political blockage if they didn't have the fossil fuel companies backing them to the tune of all that money and support in that disinformation campaign? What if Exxon had come clean in 1989? We wouldn't have gotten any of that disinformation. The merchants of doubt would have been put out of business. And we could have maybe starting in the early 1990s, at about the time the UN process was really kicking up, the United States, because then the political process would have been vastly different.
Correct.
And we might have been able to really do something about this issue.
Yes. No, it's a good point. This has been a partnership. I mean, anyone can go look up opensecrets.org and look up campaign donations and see many of these links staring us right in the face.
I mean, Congressman Upton had received over $300,000 in contributions from fossil fuel industries. And he's given them enormous subsidies.
That's right.
That have contributed to their increasing their removal of fossil fuels, polluting fuels from the ground.
Yeah.
But again, I want to come back to our listeners and say that we can make a major statement. We can push the world discussion of this forward by holding Representative Upton accountable for putting his personal power, his chairmanship, over the interests of all of us here in the 6th District, and frankly, everyone in the country, everyone around the world.
Absolutely. Well said.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, the other thing that is, to me, one of the misnomers that's going on with the Republican Party right now is the Exxon and what's going on with Volkswagen and other issues like this sort of bring out is, when left to their own devices, a business doesn't always act in the public interest, and that's sort of been part of the line here for the last few years. And I think, for me, what Exxon and Volkswagen are doing in this particular scenario is it inserts that a bit of doubt again. Who do we trust, and how can we trust, and how do we move forward with these agreements? It might put a little bit of doubt on international commitments, like how do I even trust another country? But I think it fundamentally shows we can't just trust you to go home and do the right thing.
Yeah. Well, you know, I mean, Volkswagen, okay,
Totally,
they were
yeah.
just, they made some very, very bad business decisions.
Oh, yes.
I mean, there's just no justification for
Right.
that. But generally speaking, what are we going to expect from companies, from
That's right.
corporations?
We're going to expect.
They're going to try to make their profit.
And to make it last as long as they can. As I
Right.
think, you know,
Right.
part of this disinformation is, okay, we know about that, but how long can we ride out this profit maximization strategy until
And there's
that
nothing wrong
balance
with them
hits?
trying to make
I
profits
agree.
as long as they tell the truth.
I agree.
Once they start to lie,
That's right.
and once they start to
right.
to try to specifically spread wrong information about things they know to be
That's
the
right.
case that definitely cause human harms, they should be held liable
Exactly.
for that.
Exactly. So again, this shows us, you know, well, we do need some regulations
Yeah, we do need
and
regulation.
backstops on these issues, because we can't just say that they're
But
going to do the
what
right
that takes us to is that if we're going to have an institution that's going to address that, it's
That's
got to
right.
be government.
Government.
But then that takes us around to the issue of money in politics.
right.
Because we have had so much money flooding into here in our American political system
Yes.
that everyone knows most of our politicians have been bought on many of the issues.
Right.
And frankly, we're not going to get effective action. I mean, climate change
Yeah.
is one of the main ones, but on
Right.
so many of the political issues that we face in this country without dramatically reducing the money in politics.
And yet, with Citizens United, they've basically taken the rug off that and said, hey, you know,
Right.
you can just pour as much money as you want to pour into these campaigns.
Right.
So if you're worried about money in politics, unfortunately, climate change is another area where it's been getting in the way.
It has. Absolutely.
One other possibility here also in terms of holding the fossil fuel companies accountable might be a Rico lawsuit, which stands for Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations
Yeah.
Act. And that was used against the tobacco industry.
right.
We did have a lawsuit, a Rico lawsuit, that went against the tobacco companies for the same exact thing. Deception, you know, dragging their feet over the years, denial, and because of their denial and their deception, many people were harmed.
Yes.
And so to gain some measure of accountability, they had to fund. I think almost every state got a huge amount of money
That's right.
as a
They
result
continue
of
to get
that
that
settlement,
To
right?
do
and-
education.
And let's be clear that what Exxon has done is no different from what Volkswagen has done.
Exactly.
Volkswagen did it in a car. They fiddled,
exactly
fiddled
right.
the software so the car wouldn't show the real emission. Exxon did it through disinformation,
Yes.
so people wouldn't understand that what they were producing was carbon pollution
Right.
that was going to have all the effects that now we all do get.
That's right.
Yeah, and I think what ExxonMobil did is far worse.
Far in
Oh,
terms of the
absolutely.
consequences,
Absolutely.
it's enormously
Well,
worse.
Well, it's great to bring that up in the RICO type of suits, because this information reporting on Exxon absolutely changes the game on the legal side of these
Yeah.
issues. I mean, lots of different citizens, you know, there are some great human interest stories of kids in high school suing their mayors over the harm under public nuisance. Again, without the actions of Congress, without a national policy and a real international policy, there's no legal law on what they can do. And so folks are reverting back to common law and things like public nuisance to try to sue their own mayors for inaction, right? But everyone can right now say, well, gosh, you know, this is all we knew, and we have a climate action plan now for our town, and we're going to go forward with this. But the RICO suits are a different thing. If you can go back and prove that you were actually providing disinformation, you've got a totally different legal approach there. So it's fascinating.
So a couple different legal approaches to try to gain some accountability and move things forward a little bit here.
Yes.
Now, there's one other problem with the money in politics and the funding of disinformation, and that is, if we look at Exxon right now, they don't show that they're funding any climate disinformation. Because what's happened is that several other funds have been set up, what
Right.
we now call
Called
dark
dark
money,
money,
right? Felix, you have spent a lot of time looking at this dark money issue. We have things called the Donors Trust, the Donors Capital Fund, two in particular. These two have pumped out about $125 million over the last 3 years. And that money is going to these conservative think tanks who are generating the disinformation, the deception about climate change. But we don't know who's funding them. The law doesn't require that they
disclosure.
So maybe Exxon is still funding. We don't know.
Right.
Maybe Exxon is still funding climate disinformation by giving money to these funds, but we have no way of knowing.
Right.
And that gets back to Denise's point about transparency and accountability.
Exactly.
Transparency and accountability have to be the bottom line.
They're the only
it's
other
just not
checks.
acceptable. It's not acceptable for them to have this dark money.
That's right.
That's not acceptable in a democracy.
That's right. So our only check on these other systems, it really is.
Right.
So is that going to be one of the first things you work on when you get to Congress, Paul?
Oh, you bet.
You
I'm
bet.
going to push for U.S. leadership in reducing carbon emission and getting a
Absolutely.
strong international agreement with all the countries on board in building the institutions that will be able to effectively move us to that 2 degrees Celsius or below greenhouse gas emissions.
One of the other things that's happened recently with regard to the climate change issue that maybe is helping to create some kind of moral force to move us forward and to deal with this in the political process might have been Pope Francis's his encyclical, first of all, that came out last summer, and then of course his visit to the U.S. where he addressed the U.S. Congress. Paul, I know you've done a little bit of reading about Pope Francis's influence in this area. What do you think the effect is going to be of the Pope, of all people, this enormously popular figure, coming out and basically saying to the United States, you got to do more about this problem. The world's got to do more about this problem.
Well, the Pope has emerged as one of the real moral leaders of our time. And he's been talking about this in terms of poverty. Yep. He's been talking about this in terms of greed in corporations. And what we've been talking about is the corporations, we know that they do whatever is in their interest to make profits, and that's how they're organized. But the Pope is saying, that's not right. We shouldn't be accepting that as our way to move forward. And that he's in his personal style, he's welcomed the homeless into the Vatican. And he's setting up places for the homeless to come and stay in the center of Catholicism as a very profound example of the direction that he thinks we need to be going. And he's been equally strong on the issue of climate change and care for nature. And he uses very strong words.
He believes it's a social justice issue, and coming from his background, which is different from any other pope that we've ever had, he comes from an underserved population, so he knows what it means to live in impoverished conditions. So he can speak to those issues with a great deal of conviction and carry a lot of weight with the rest of the world when he makes those statements.
He absolutely does believe it's a social justice issue. That's entirely correct. Yeah. But he also understands that he believes that the earth is God's creation, and that we humans are also in the image of Christ, of God, and that we need to be caring for one another, and we need to be caring for the creation, and we have not been doing that. That he says we've been treating the earth like a garbage can.
Yes.
And that's just not, for anyone who's a Christian, in terms of our responsibility to sustain the gifts of the earth that we've been given for our children and future generations, that for other species of life that are also creations of God. Right now, climate change, within this century, we could see 30% of species or more going extinct. That's not something that we humans should be doing.
Yeah.
And the Pope is speaking out about this. We also know that the primary victims of climate change are who? They're the poor. They're the dispossessed. Right. For the most part, it's not going to be, the Exxon executives, they may get caught in a hurricane somewhere, but their homes are probably not going to be the homes that are going to get flooded out. Right. Their kids are probably not the kids who are going to have to become refugees. But if we look in the faces of those people who are becoming the refugees because of climate change and say, well, what is our responsibility to you? That's the kind of thing that the Pope is saying that we all need to do.
It's interesting how, the whole movement of liberation theology in the Catholic Church, particularly in Latin America, back in the 80s, was very strong, and the official church really distanced itself from liberation theology, and it almost seems like Pope Francis now is sort of welcoming back into the church at least some of the tenets of liberation theology and this concentration of the preferential option for the poor. That was the central tenet of liberation theology.
I'll tell you, I think just look at the Gospels. You just look at what Christ says to his disciples, to the people. He says, blessed are the peacemakers.
Right.
He says, we need to be caring for the poor among us. He says, feed my sheep. I mean, the message of the gospel is a message of care for every human being, particularly the most vulnerable,
right.
particularly the poorest. I mean, maybe it's liberation theology, maybe it's just basic theology. He's just, he's like, okay, he's read this stuff quite a few times.
Yes. Yes.
It might be basic theology, but it certainly wasn't the message that came across in most mainstream U.S. churches for quite some time.
Well, we've had many times when the churches have promoted things that have been very inconsistent with my understanding of real Christianity.
Right.
I mean, if we go back in history, there'll be plenty of examples when
right.
the church has been most un-Christ-like,
yes.
but that's no excuse.
Right.
So now we've got Pope Francis taking a strong moral stance on this issue. I know there are other churches outside the Catholic Church that are also concerned with this issue. We had, right here in our own community, a series, the Hope for Creation series, where a number of our local churches came together and met on, I think they had like a 6 or 7 week kind of program, didn't they, where they focused on this issue. And and even some of the more fundamentalist churches seem to be, some of them, not all of them, seem to be adopting a new stance where, yes, aren't we supposed to be caring for God's creation? Isn't that a part of the message? So even on the more fundamentalist conservative side, we see some church leaders coming out now and talking a little bit more about climate change. Is that a hopeful opening as well?
I think so. I hope so. A lot of the movements that you've seen with the Tea Party and the conservative base have been focused on the religious right as well. So this is, to me, a very hopeful change in the idea of what it means to be a Christian and what it means to be involved in environmental issues. That it's not so ideological, that this is a faith-based issue just as much as it's a science issue in any issue.
And part of what I think has been happening has been just the information, the understanding has been gradually seeping in just how utterly serious this is. Yeah. And I know, Ron, you've talked about this with words I can't use on TV, as we can say about the oh my goodness moment.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
When you look at this, and one example I think is very helpful is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change.
Right.
They now expect maybe 3 feet of rise in sea level, but they put their criteria in place in 1992 for what they're going to count in their statistics, all right? And so there's been a lot of science that's moved forward that gives very strong conclusions but don't fit the specific algorithms, the specific numbers that allow them to come into this. So for that 3 feet of sea level rise, only 1 centimeter, less than half an inch, comes from Antarctica, right? However, there's been substantial research that indicates that maybe in this century, maybe in next century, within the next 200 years, we're very likely to get over 6 feet of sea level rise from Antarctica. But we don't know enough to say what the percentage likelihood of that is by 2100. So they don't allow that research into the estimates because of the protocols way back when. So what that's indicating is that, well, we already understand that 3 feet of sea level rise is going to be terrible, but it could turn out within this century, it's not 3 feet, but 9 feet.
Yes.
And 9 feet, I mean, you're talking about losing New York. We know we're going to lose New Orleans. We know we're going to lose Miami. But if we lose New York, and Philadelphia, and Boston, and Los Angeles.
Don't forget about Seattle.
And Seattle.
Our West Coast friends.
Right.
And not to mention what that means in terms of temperatures.
That's
Indeed.
right.
Yeah.
Right.
And Paul's point, this is so huge. I'm so glad you brought that up because all of these calls from the IPCC are so dire and so intense. And what we have to remember is those are the most conservative and most cautious scientific formulations of what might happen. That's on the, like if you got the estimate for your landscaping or your paint job, that's the low side. people.
Right.
That's not even
Right.
what might be possible. And that is one of the fundamentally really scary things about this.
And part of, we talked to a lot of scientists about this.
Yeah.
And one thing that they tell me is, okay, look, over the last million years, that the carbon dioxide level has fluctuated between 180 and 320 parts per million. We're already at 450.
Right.
We're already at 400, excuse me. We're on our way to 450. The science of what happens when you get to 450 and above 450 is just very uncertain. We've not been there for a million years.
Right.
We're seeing a change that is so much more rapid in our atmosphere than we've ever had, than the scientific evidence going back a million years can ever find. So the science on this is just not that reliable.
Yeah.
And the more scientists look in different directions, the more frightening it becomes. I gave an example with Antarctica. There are examples like that with Brazilian rainforest, with the Indian monsoon. It could collapse. With the Great Barrier Reef could be disintegrating. We could see the Gulf Stream move from Europe down south. And then oddly, because the Gulf Stream is what brings the warmth in the winter to Europe, oddly, global warming could lead to freezing in London and Dublin and Paris. So the scientists cannot believe how slow the politicians have been to take this seriously.
So we're back to the effort of the denialists.
Yeah.
Right.
We're
Yes.
back to Exxon and the other fossil fuel companies deliberately sabotaging the political process by
Yes.
funding conservative think tanks who generate the disinformation and create doubt, and that allows then cover for the Fred Uptons of the world to then say, well, the science is uncertain and we don't really know, when we do know,
Right.
but it gives them a sort of a political cover.
Yeah.
And it also then feeds into what it provides. It creates this culture of denial. It makes available to just regular people who maybe have a conservative ideology, who are individualistic and hierarchical in their thinking, and they see information about climate change as a threat to their worldview, to their ideology.
That one more thing that the government's trying to shove down their
That's
throats.
right.
You know?
That strong government action is going to be necessary, which is absolutely right. That strong government action is going to be necessary. We're going to have to regulate corporations even more.
Right.
And so this is such a threat to their own worldview that they then totally reject the independent evidence.
Right.
And again, the fact that we have this movement, this denialist movement, providing them with information and a frame that they can utilize has gummed up the process even more.
And that's exactly right. One thing that I think is kind of interesting and potentially hopeful, part of what we know is that we're going to need a number of very dramatic changes to address this. But we've talked about fundamentalist Christians who historically tended to be on the denialist side.
Yes.
But now many of them, not just a few, many of their leaders are saying that creation care means that they've got to take global warming seriously. We're seeing the polls saying we're going back to where a substantial majority of Americans understand climate change is real, it's serious, we need to have serious action, that we could see a transition in the political landscape. We could see a substantial movement towards the kind of change that we need within a couple of years.
Right.
That could happen very quickly. And if we watch the political debate around the country, there are a lot of people who get it, that our federal government is not working.
Yeah.
It's not solving, not just climate change, any number of problems, and therefore we need major change. We need to be moving in major new directions. And if we get the political will behind that, you talk to students at Western.
Yes.
And there are so many students these days, I know, Denise, you talk to many of them, who kind of wonder, well, for my future, what's my future going to be like if we don't deal with this? Why is this happening? Well, they know they're figuring out it's because of Exxon and their disinformation. They're figuring out because of Congressman Upton and his power plays. They're figuring out that we've got to make some pretty significant change here.
That's
and
right.
we're seeing movements among students that I have not seen for many years in my, that I kind of remember from the 60s and 70s. But
So it's a pretty unified voice. I'm finally old enough to have gotten the question just last week in class. So why didn't you guys do anything? What are you guys doing? oh my gosh, here we are. We're you know, and I do think that shift though in the political ideology, you know, it's the Pope coming out. That's a new political audience and a shift that might happen. But it's also the arguments that the left, the Democratic debate Tuesday night can make. This needs to be framed in things that the ideological can hear. So if you make a jobs argument, all the jobs that are going to be in solar and wind
and what's
transition,
exciting is
that
that
can get
if
those
we can
people on
move
board.
in this direction towards renewable energy, solar and
That's
wind,
right.
your energy is going to be locally controlled. It's going to be non-polluting.
That's right.
It's actually going to create more jobs than
Right.
nuclear, more jobs than a polluting coal-based power plant. So the future in a sustainable world is a better future.
That's right.
Not to mention that it also avoids the problem of climate change.
Right, and I now hear, you know, Paul making those kind of great arguments. That's what moves another side of the middle or the right over to climate change, right? You can't gonna win this argument on facts. So what is that ideology? Jobs. Let's talk about that because we have those numbers.
We can be building, like Michigan can be the manufacturing
That's right.
center for the wind energy.
That's right.
We can be a manufacturing center for many of the pieces of the solar industry.
I mean,
now, unfortunately, Germany has been moving way ahead of us.
That's right.
And because Germany has seen how serious this is, they know that the demand in the future is going to be for clean energy, and they know they've got to build it at home first.
Right.
I mean, think about this. We have a wind turbine academy at KVCC,
Yes,
where I work
that's
at,
right.
that almost every person who goes through that program is placed in a job.
Right.
We're talking 95 to 98%
That's amazing.
And Felix,
placement.
how much of those people make in like a year or two in?
$40,000 to $60,000.
Those are good jobs.
I've read sometimes with overtime 80,000 plus within 2 or 3
they're
years.
being placed all over the world, so we know there's a demand. Our academies are always full, and all these men and women who do graduate, I said they get jobs.
That's right.
So we know that this is reducing employment for folks.
Yes.
We've got to be forward-looking in terms of building the
Because we don't have a coal
manufacturing.
mining. We don't have a coal mining
degree.
academy.
Right.
We don't have that, you know.
Yeah.
And we
I think
don't.
people get that, you know.
Exactly.
Right.
Yes.
Well, I think we just have a couple of minutes left, and Denise, I just wanted you to talk a little bit more about the WMU working group on climate change. We'll be meeting later today, and we've got
That's
some
right.
things where we've got a couple minutes left, so can you just kind of quickly
Sure.
let us know about what the group's been up to?
Sure. So the Climate Change Working Group is about 40 different faculty, about 20 of whom maybe show up for a meeting. We've got a couple things that were in the works. There's a few writing an op-ed on solar panels and some new legislation that may or may not improve the economics of that situation. That's something we're watching very closely. And we mostly are trying to get together an event. These Paris talks are happening the first 2 weeks of December, right? December like 1st to 16th. So right in the middle of that, December 4th, which in all Kalamazoo good citizens will know is the first Friday, is an art hop. On December 4th, we are planning to do something around downtown with the art hop, and we're trying to figure out good ways that we could support a successful global outcome in Paris, that we could get our citizens involved in knowing about what's going on in Paris and how they might support that outcome. So that's our kind of big event. December 4th, watch for more information on that. And just like last year, the last time Felix and I spoke, we're going to do another common read in the spring. I believe the book is called Don't Even Think About It, and this idea about how our brains are wired to either think or not think about climate change, which has been part of this discussion. So watch for those two things.
Right, we had a very successful event last year with Naomi Klein's book, This Changes Everything, and now the film, the documentary film, This Changes Everything, has just come out, and we're going to try to get that to Kalamazoo as soon as we can as well.
Yes.
And one final thing, we have a new minor in climate change studies at Western, so we should mention that.
That's exactly right. Yes, so that rolled out this year. Please come. Anyone can come take advantage of that.
Sounds good. Well, again, I want to thank you, Paul, for being here. Again, Paul Clements, candidate for the 6th Congressional District, running against Fred Upton. Yeah. Denise, who's been doing tremendous work as the effective chair of the Working Group on Climate Change.
Thank you.
Felix, great to see you as always, and we hope that you'll join us again next time. Don Cooney, by the way, should be back next time around. He's on assignment this week. But we hope you join us again on Critical Issues, Alternative Views.